Good evening. It's like my kindergarten class when I was. All right. My name is Lizzie Magruder, and I'm glad to welcome you tonight to the Tales of Cape Cod. As you have seen probably every Monday night, except for some of the holidays during the summer, we have an evening presentation. Our speaker tonight is Carolyn Ravenscroft, an archivist and historian at the Drew Archival Library, Duxbury Rural and Historical Society. She earned a BS in History from Northeastern University and an MA and an MLS in History and Library Science at Simmons University. We would like to thank our generous sponsors of tonight's program, Lynn and Steve Hesslinger. Are they here tonight? No? Okay. Between the late 18th century and the early 19th century, hundreds of ships were built in the small town of Duxbury. Much is known about the major male figures of the era, but little has been said about the women. Our speaker, Carolyn, has embarked on her own mission to change that. She has discovered over 40 women who sailed from 1804 to 1890 and has personalized their stories and brought them to life. Their stories are stories of birth, marriage, life, and death at sea. Please welcome Carolyn Ravenscroft.
Thank you. I am so happy to be here because I am a Cape Cod girl. I am a proud graduate of DY. So it's always nice to come back home, even though I work now and live on the South Shore. So tonight I'm going to be talking about Duxbury's women at sea, but their stories are fun and universal. Some are a little sad, but I think we can all relate to them and we'll all enjoy them. But the stories themselves are kind of like the cake. First, we have to get through some of the other history to kind of put it into perspective for everyone. So first, I always like to start by telling a little bit about how this research came about. So at the Duxbury Rural and Historical Society, for which I work, we have two house museums. One is our large, grand flagship museum, and that is the Ezra Weston House, also known as the King Caesar House. And that was the home to arguably one of the largest shipbuilders in America in the early 19th century. Now, our other house museum is a little more modest. That is built by Ezra Weston's brother-in-law and his wife in 1807. And that house always got less visitation, obviously. If you come all the way to Duxbury, you want to see the big King Caesar house, and they were like, oh yeah, there's a sea captain's house. But so as that house sat and we needed to kind of bolster its attendance, we decided to reimagine that house to tell the story of 19th century women's history through the lens of the four daughters who lived there. None of them, by the way, went to sea. But they were abolitionists, two were Civil War nurses, and they were fantastic and fabulous women. So in about 2015, we started a long process to reinterpret that Bradford house. When we were changing it around, there was this little alcove on the second floor landing. And when the Bradfords lived there, that is where they would put extra guests. Their house was overflowing with guests during the summer months. So when we had to reinterpret the house, we thought, what are we going to do with this little space at the top of the stairs? And we decided that we would continue to have it for guests, only now the guests would be a different exhibit every summer that told a little-known story of Duxbury's history. Our first summer in 2017 was very successful. We had a little story about an author that the Bradford sisters knew in that spot. But the second year, we needed to decide what we were going to put. So in January 2018, we had a staff meeting to talk about our summer season. What are we going to put in this little space? And the idea came to the fore what about women who went to sea from Duxbury? Are there any of those? And I said, well, yeah, I know about 3, maybe 4 Duxbury women who went to sea. Small space, small story. We have some portraits of the ships they went on, and I'm sure we can find some objects related to them. And so that's what we decided to do, little story about women at sea. But it was January, and I didn't have to install the exhibit until June. That gave me plenty of time to wonder, I wonder if there are any other women I could find from Duxbury that went to sea. So I started embarking on this project. Now, finding women's history is difficult because many of the things that filter into our archives and libraries are the papers of the guys from the 19th century. How we define history up until the 1960s was really men, predominantly white men, doing manly things. And so in the Drew Archived Library that I work in, we have dozens of logbooks, crew manifests, cargo manifests, shipping instructions, but those are all the business records of sea travel. Those don't tell you women's stories. So where do you find women's history? Well, you start looking, as I did, through all the collections, all the letters we have. And what I was looking for was any letter that gave any hint that a woman went to sea. For example, my sister just returned from a voyage, or Mrs. Alexander Wadsworth just left with her husband. So I began systematically going through literally hundreds of records looking for these clues, and I began to find them. Then I looked through vital records and census records. Because guess what? If a baby is born in a foreign port or at sea, mom's probably there too. So I was able to find some women in that way. Contemporary newspaper reports, secondary sources, unpublished memoirs, reminiscences, you name it, I scoured it. Embarrassingly, some of these stories were staring at me all along, and I should have known them. But others were very obscure, and it took a lot of digging to find them. As I did all this work, eventually, let me see if I'm going the right way here. I did indeed find. The number now is about 40. I think when we launched the exhibit in 2018, I had about 33. But talk about women who wanted to be found. Once I started looking, I couldn't stop finding them, even when I wasn't really looking for them. People would come into the archives to research their house history and just say, oh, I have a portrait of a woman that was painted in China in 1870. And I'd be like, wait, you do? So we kept adding to the list. For some of these women, all I know is that they went to sea. I really don't know anything else about them. But for some, I know the ship they went on and some fantastical stories about their voyages. And so they run the gamut. I also cast a very wide net. If you were a woman born in Duxbury and you married a Duxbury mariner, you're a Duxbury woman at sea. But if you marry a mariner from someplace else, you're still a Duxbury woman at sea. And conversely, if you're a mariner who marries a woman, in some instances, as far away as France, she's still a Duxbury woman at sea. I didn't know where the research was going to go, so I didn't want to leave anybody out. Now, speaking of vital statistics, in the course of my research, I found 9 births at sea. I've had 2 children. Neither would I want to give birth at sea. The little girl up there on the right, Rio de Janeiro, Windsor, I'll give you one guess where she was born. So sometimes they have unusual names. Little Rio obviously was born in Rio de Janeiro. We have Manilus Baker, born aboard the clipper ship Manilus. And we also have Seaborn Wadsworth, born at sea. We have a few marriages. That beautiful young woman there is Minnie Windsor. She went to sea with her parents, Captain Gershom Windsor and his wife. She went on a number of voyages with her parents. In 1866, she was aboard her parents. Her father was captaining the clipper, the Continental. The Continental happened to be going around Cape Horn up to San Francisco, carrying a load of women, the Mercer girls. Were on that ship. If you remember the 7 brides for 7 brothers, those are the Mercer girls. So her father's ship was carrying the passengers of these mail order brides. They got to San Francisco. She met a sea captain named Captain Gershom Bradford. He squired her around town. They fell in love. She moved her luggage from her parents' ship to Captain Gershom Bradford's coastal survey ship, and she spent years at sea with him. And sadly, we have some deaths. Sea travel is hazardous, and the places these women are often going have diseases like yellow fever and smallpox, and we have instances, sadly, of at least 5 deaths, and those include both women and children. So the question then is this important? Or is this just fun, anecdotal stories of women going to sea? Does it add anything to the broader 19th century women's history? And I have to say, the answer to that is yes. When I discovered so many women who went to sea from such a small town as Duxbury, but you combine that with the research that's been done down here by my former high school history teacher, Jim Coogan, and you combine it with work that's been done in New Bedford and in Maine and in various other places, in the aggregate, you begin to see that women going to sea is a much bigger and broader story, and it changes the way we perceive women's roles in the 19th century. But for me, working for the Duxbury Historical Society, it absolutely was important. Because let me give you a little primer on Duxbury history, because many of you probably know the town of Duxbury as that swank South Shore town, sometimes called Deluxebury. But we have very good history there. Duxbury has 2 main historical eras on which we hang our hat. The first is our Great Pilgrim era. The town of Duxbury was settled in the 1620s by John Alden and Priscilla and Miles Standish and William Brewster and George Sole and Francis Sprague and a number of other Mayflower passengers. In fact, our name Duxbury comes from Miles Standish. There's a Duxborough Hall that the Standish family owns over in England. So Duxbury is very steeped in Pilgrim history. However, if you come to Duxbury expecting to see a lot of what we call first period homes, those early 17th, late 17th, early 18th century homes, we've got them, but you're probably going to be disappointed because our grand historic era is not full of early colonial homes. It's full of the grand homes built by our shipbuilders and sea captains during our shipbuilding era. And that went from about the time of the American Civil War all the way to the mid-1840s. Duxbury built almost 1,000 ships. The great preponderance of them were merchant traders. So Duxbury ships plied the Atlantic and Mediterranean trade routes. They went down to the Caribbean, and they were known as some of the best ships around. So that's where King Caesar comes in. And so, for example, our King Caesar house is there at the top. Our Washington Street is known as the Old Shipbuilders District. The ship Hope, built in 1841 by Ezra West and King Caesar, was the largest merchant vessel built in America at that time. It was a cotton freighter, and it set the record for the number of bales of cotton that it shipped over to Liverpool. And then on the way back, Irish passengers filled its hold. Not a pleasant trip. So when we talk about that history in Duxbury, and believe me, we do, what we're talking about are the shipbuilders, the caulkers, the riggers, the sailmakers, the blacksmiths, the tinsmiths, the sea captains, the sailors, and that by definition is a very male-dominated history. When we talk about women at all in that era, it's just the waiting wives. Not to diminish waiting wives, they're very important holding down the home front, but even they get very short end of the deal. So to put women in such large numbers on the ships puts them squarely into the narrative, and it changes the way we think about Duxbury's maritime history. In fact, I have stopped referring to it as Duxbury shipbuilding history and simply call it maritime history because it actually extends beyond the end of our shipbuilding. So before we get to the stories, I just have one more graph to point out to you. So I was the person doing this research. I was the person who was plugging in the dates of the journeys, and then through the magic of Excel, I created this graph, and I went, that's not at all what I thought it would look like. I just told you that our great shipbuilding era went from about 1798 all the way to the mid-1840s, and yet, we have very few women going to sea during that period. That shocked me a little bit. And then, when our shipbuilding era is over, when the town of Duxbury falls into a depression, because nothing filled that void when shipbuilding moved to Boston, we begin to have more than ever women going to sea. So how do we explain this? Trust me, I can. Otherwise, I wouldn't have shown you the slide. We would have gone right to the stories. So, in the first 20 years of this country, things were pretty hazardous on the Atlantic Ocean. Now remember, the ships built in Duxbury and all the women are going to be talking about are merchant traders, not whalers, and I've yet to find a woman who wants to go on a fishing voyage. So they're all merchant ships. And merchant ships are very susceptible to what's going on in the international world. So if there are wars, if there are broken treaties, if there are privateers, merchant vessels are going to be targeted. And so, in the first 15 years of the 19th century, we have some real problems for merchant ships. Between 1798 and 1800, we have this little thing called the quasi-war with France. It's an undeclared war under the Adams administration, but French privateers are unleashed on American merchant vessels. Well over 100 merchant vessels were attacked. Twice, our Captain Gamaliel Bradford from Duxbury had to fend off French privateers. The second time he did it, it was an all-day battle, cannons raging. He lost his leg in the course of the battle. So I ask you, is this a time where Gamaliel's going to say to his wife, Elizabeth, hey, Bets, you know, it'd be fun? Let's go to sea. Probably not. Then the Napoleonic Wars start. That is England versus France, but embroils all their allies. In order to keep merchant vessels out of the fray, Jefferson enacts an embargo. No trade with those foreign combatants, because if a merchant vessel goes to trade with England, France is like, excuse me, no. And conversely, if they go to trade with France, England says, I think I'll capture you today. So we stay out with the embargo. That puts a huge dent in the Eastern Seaboard's economy. And did people thwart the embargo? Yes, they did. Our Captain Gershom Bradford, for example, thwarted the embargo. He took his ship Mercury. As he's sailing across the ocean, he gets captured by the French on his birthday, no less, and held for 6 months. He's not the only merchant captain to succumb to that. So I ask you, would Gershom say to his wife, Sally, hey, Sal, leave the kids at home. Come thwart the embargo with me? Probably not. And then, of course, we have the lead up to the War of 1812, followed by the War of 1812 that goes to 1815. So you can see there are very few pockets of time that it is safe for merchant mariners on the Atlantic. Not a good time to bring your wife with you, which is why we probably have such low numbers. But I would argue that there is another reason, and that is cultural. In Duxbury, prior to the American Revolution, we had been an agrarian kind of just little town. We had some fishing, but we weren't certainly an outward-looking cosmopolitan kind of place. And all the women that were born just before the American Revolution and grew up to marry sea captains in the first 2 decades of the 19th century, they're not expecting to go to sea. Their mothers didn't go to sea. They grew up on farms. And so we have this cultural kind of situation where women aren't looking to go to sea. Now, by the time we get to the 1820s to the 1840s, things have settled down on the Atlantic trade routes, but also the young women who are marrying mariners in Duxbury at that point now have grown up in a maritime economy. They have grown up in the large stately homes that their parents have built. They are full of foreign goods. Duxbury is a very outward-looking place. As ships are launched in Duxbury, school children get out of school for the day to watch these large ships go down into the bay. And now these young women, it's not just their fathers and uncles that are going to see, it's their brothers and cousins and schoolmates. And so we start seeing women that have a little bit more wanderlust themselves. I think I would if I lived during that period. And so we begin to see more women going to sea. When our shipbuilding tanks in Duxbury and shipbuilding moves to Boston, mariners still call Duxbury home. So we have a number of women who begin to sail on the large clipper ships. We have in Duxbury some of the most famous clippers, like the Flying Cloud, the Herald of the Morning, the Thatcher Magoon, captained by Duxbury guys. Now they're not just going across the Atlantic on a short voyage, now they're going around the globe as they ping-pong around from port to port. And basically, if you want to see your husband, you will go to sea with him. So some of the women in the later part of the 19th century that we'll talk about, they're the ones that are giving birth on the ships. Their daughters are getting married from the ships. They've got pianos lashed to the stateroom floors. They have libraries. They have monkeys. They have great stories. Those are the stories, too, that we start to see shipwrecks and a lot of fantastical things happen. At the very end there, Duxbury's economy has completely changed. Duxbury is more akin to what it is today, a summertime resort community. And for people who come back to Duxbury in the latter half of the 19th century, it looks completely different than it did during our shipbuilding era. And the only captains are the old salty dogs rocking on their front porches, reminiscing about the good old days. So that is the history. Now let's get to the stories. So the first story I have for you is the story of Sally Drew Bradford. She's that outlier. She's our very first woman at sea that I was able to find. Her parents and her family, the Drew family, are very large shipbuilders. They're almost as big as King Caesar would become. But she married a sea captain from town named Captain Daniel Bradford. And in 1805, they leave their little daughter at home with Sally's parents, and they set out on a voyage to Antwerp. They actually left from Philadelphia, heading across to Antwerp. And when they got to about the Grand Banks, they hit a horrific gale. So this storm dismasted them. And it was very, very frightening. So I just want to read a little bit about what Sally said of the storm. Let me get her page here. A few minutes before the masts went, I went up the stairs and looked on deck. It was so dreadful that I had scarce strength left to get back to the cabin. I saw Mr. Bradford give his orders with as much calmness as at any other time. When I heard the masts go, I had not the least idea of living but a few minutes. My strongest sensations were that my sweet Emily and you all would look for our return and that you would never see us. I tried to compose myself with the thought that I should die with my husband. It was out of my power to compose myself. If I ever live to get home, it will do me good. I shall not easily forget it and the other trials we have had. So after this horrific storm, Captain Bradford jury-rigs a mast. Other ships come across him and ask if he wants assistance. And he's like, heck no, good, we're good. We're heading to Antwerp. We got this. But then, British ship of the line, the Ramillies, came alongside of it. Now, this would be like an 18-wheeler coming across a station wagon. The Ramillies is like a 70-gun ship. And it isn't looking to offer to help the Hercules. Oh, no, it's a prize. So they take Captain Bradford's papers, they put English seamen aboard the ship, and they begin towing it around the Atlantic. And eventually, they tow it to England. Now comes a long, protracted battle for Daniel to get his ship back, which he does, and then he has to repair it, which he does, and then they actually go to Antwerp. He completes that voyage. During the course of this, Sally becomes pregnant, and I know that because I can do math, and I can count months. And so she's having not such a fun time. This has been a very difficult experience for her. And it makes me wonder, what were their conversations like as they were sailing back to America? Because shortly thereafter, they sold their house in Duxbury, moved to Keene, New Hampshire, and Daniel became a gentleman farmer. So that cannot have been a coincidence. They went on to have 5 more children, and 2 of their sons returned to Duxbury and became mariners themselves. So the pull of the ocean was still strong in that Bradford Drew family, but Sally had no more, had none of it. Now, the next stories I want to tell you are the honeymooners. So by honeymooners, I do not mean that these women stood up in their front parlors, said their vows, and then immediately went off to sea. I mean that within the first couple years of their married life, before they settled down to a home of their own and children, they took that opportunity to take at least one voyage to sea. For some honeymooners, it really was one and done. And for others, it was the start of a lifetime at sea. But these 2 women particularly help illustrate the 2 questions I asked myself when I was starting this research. And A, why do women want to go to sea? And B, why do husbands want their wives with them at sea? And so each of these stories will illustrate those. So the first, we have this beautiful young woman that is Marcia Packard. For those of you who care about genealogy, she is an Alden. Her father was a sea captain named Captain Henry Packard. And in 1836, Marcia got engaged to a captain named Robert Welch. Now, Robert Welch was about to be given command the largest ship yet built in Duxbury, a ship called the Eliza Warwick. So you must assume that if he's going to get this big ship, that he must be a really smart captain. But one of the neighbors said of him, Captain Freeman Soule was here Saturday, and he says he knows Captain Welch very well, and he's the biggest liar and the biggest fool he ever saw, and everybody knows it wherever he goes. Now, Marcia didn't think he was, obviously. She's in love with him, and speaking of love, that is one of the most compelling reasons that you want to go to sea with your husband, because you love him. This is the early 19th century. This is the time of love matches. These aren't arranged marriages, so Marcia must think that Captain Welch is pretty all right. Now, the second reason you'd want to go to sea is this, or the second and third, actually, are the same reasons we want to go to sea: sightseeing and shopping. Marcia has a very fine education. She's learning geography, philosophy, foreign languages. She's reading novels. She's probably reading the Waverley novels by Scott. So she knows what there is over in Europe. She knows what she wants to see. These women definitely want to see sights. And not just see sights, they also get to have experiences that they would never get in Duxbury, like having 7 or 8 course meals at the consulate where their husband's ship goes, or seeing lavish foreign weddings in India or China. There are things that these women get to do that you would never get to do if you didn't go to sea. So sightseeing and having these experiences is high on the list, just like it would be for us today. Now, let's not poo-poo shopping, because shopping is actually also high on women's lists, because I have seen many instances in letters where women are giving instructions to their sea captain husbands or their friends who are going abroad and saying, will you pick me up this? Will you get me this? And our collections at the Historical Society are full of objects brought back as gifts from sea captain husbands. But gifts are all well and good. But if you're going to be eating dishes brought from Europe for the rest of your life, you want to have your husband pick them out, or do you want to pick them out? You want your husband to get you the latest French shoes, or do you want to get the latest French shoes? It actually is a compelling reason, and again, it's not foreign to us because we shop when we go to sea as well. So those three, love of your husband and the experience in sightseeing, are valid reasons. And we know that that's what Marcia's thinking because one of her friends wrote, "How do you think Marcia will like going to sea? When she's seasick and homesick, I suppose she'll say, 'Well, I shall see enough when I get to London to pay me for all of this.'" So there you have it. Now, was Captain Welch a fool or was he a smart guy? I'll let you be the judge. This is a letter written by Marcia's neighbor, Charlotte Bradford, to her sister about Marcia's voyage. She said, "Marcia has met with a sad accident during her voyage. The 6th day out, they had a very severe gale, the worst time that Captain Welch ever knew. It was a very bad time, and the vessel was thrown on her beam ends, came very near oversetting, and Captain Welch was thrown down, struck his head, and put his little toe out of joint, and was otherwise injured. He was carried to the cabin senseless, wherefore Marcia got out of her berth, thinking he was dead, and then the vessel rolled and sent her across the cabin. She then got into bed, had a crying spell, and then got up and helped set the toe and do it up. And as soon as it was done, there was a trunk that got loose and come against it and put it out again. Captain Welch was confined to the cabin 5 days, and when he arrived at Mobile, had not been able to wear a boot or a shoe. After this, they struck the Bahama Banks and lost 2 anchors, so that poor Marcia's voyage, in which she did not expect any bad weather, has turned out rather sadly." So there you go. Now, the other woman there is Jane Windsor, who marries her cousin, Captain Gershom Windsor, so she's Jane Windsor. So that happened. I know a lot down here on the Cape as well. You go around the world and marry your first cousin. Now, Jane and Captain Gershom Windsor are a good example of why a captain might want to bring his wife with him. Now, you can disagree with me, but I'm going to posit that being a 19th century merchant sea captain is possibly one of the hardest jobs you could have at that period. It is so incredibly stressful, and these men truly had to be Renaissance men. They were in charge of the ship, making sure that ship got from point A to point B. They were in charge of the cargo, making sure not only the cargo arrived safely, but that they got the best price for the cargo at the port they were at, or had to make a decision to go somewhere else. So they had to be economists and businessmen and sea captains and navigators. They were in charge of their crew. They had to maintain discipline. They had to keep their crew respecting them, so they couldn't go singing in the forecastle and having a good time. They had to stay aloof. They got very little sleep because they always had to have one eye open because the buck stopped with them. So the profit of the ship owners, the profit of the people who put the cargo and entrusted that cargo to them, and their own financial well-being is wrapped up in this very stressful job. 4 Duxbury sea captains went insane, and one of their fellow captains said, "It is the stress of being a captain." And alcoholism was also a large problem. So it's a very hard job. So if you are married, like Captain Gershom Windsor is, to this young, beautiful woman named Jane, who you love dearly, if you bring her on a voyage with you, will you have a confidant? You have a person to help take care of you when you're not feeling well. You have a person to share the voyage with. This is a compelling reason to bring a wife on board. And some merchant sea lines actually encouraged you to bring your wife on board. They certainly knew it kept down the amount of drinking a captain would do, but it also made him a better captain, they thought sometimes. Now, when it comes to Jane and Gershom, they head down to Richmond, Virginia on the ship Amulet and pick up a load of tobacco. And then they set across on a 40-day voyage to Bristol, England. Now, it is a very squally trip according to Captain Gershom. And he didn't just pick up tobacco in Virginia, he picked up an illness because he's feverish the whole voyage over. You know who's not feverish? Jane. So Jane is able to help take care of him during this very stormy passage. When they arrive in Bristol, Captain Gershom Windsor is tied to the ship. He has to oversee repairs and make sure that cargo gets discharged properly and new cargo is brought on. So he can't spend time with Jane. Does Jane mind? No, she's very self-sufficient and she goes and shops and sightsees herself. So these are real points of pride for Gershom Windsor. He has chosen a good wife. And while he's in England, he writes a number of letters, and I'm going to read one to you right now, a little bit of one. He says, "My wife Jane is very well and sends her respects to you and says you must go and see her mother as soon as you get into Boston and tell her she is happy as a clam. I am going out shopping with her today for the first time since here, but she goes every day alone or gets someone to go with her and knows all the way about Bristol. She begins to think she will want a few things in the housekeeping line. She enjoys herself very well and glad as yet that she came. My wife is the prettiest woman in Bristol. She sits now by my side making drawers." So that is such a lovely tableau. We also know she's pregnant right now. So you have this loving couple ensconced in his cabin's quarters, and she's sewing while he's writing this letter. So there are real true reasons why you would want your wife with you. And boy, sometimes wives really wanted to go to sea with their husbands. This is Sally Freeman Dawes, and she longed to go to sea with her husband. And so we have about 9 letters that she wrote to her husband, begging him to go, allowing her to go to sea. And she used that ploy, if any of you have teenagers, it's the ploy, everyone has it. She said, everyone's going to sea. My dad, who's sitting in the front, used to say, not everyone, because you don't. But anyway, she uses this cajoling language, and it's through her letters I was able to find a lot of Duxbury women who went to sea. But Sally married when she was 26 years old, and her husband had been at sea since he was 12, and when he was in his 20s, he was already in the command of his own ships. He sailed for a Kingston firm, and he was plying at that time the Mediterranean fruit trade. And when he was home, stateside, the home port for his ships was New York. So that meant that even when he was in the United States, he wasn't close enough to Sally to see her regularly. She estimated that in the first 2 years of their marriage, they only saw each other a total of 4 months. And she is really a woman in between, because while she's a married adult woman, she's still boarding with her parents, and all of her bills are paid by her father-in-law because her husband sends his money directly to his dad. So she has no responsibilities, and she is, I know we are not supposed to psychoanalyze people in the past, but she is sad. She is very, very depressed. She takes copious amounts of her elixir, which is probably a laudanum or alcohol-based patent medicine, and she sees a mesmerist. She goes to a variety of doctors to find what ails her, and I think what ails her is she wants to go to sea. So I'm going to read a bit of Sally Dawes' letter. This is combining a couple letters. She says, "Oh, my dear husband, it is just a week this very hour since you left me, and never can I tell you what I have suffered since that time. I find I never knew what it was to part with you before. It seems as if I must see you when it comes night, but when I think you are torn from me, it seems as if my heart would break, and I feel as if I was left alone in the world. Oh, Josephus, I miss you more and more every day. You must make up your mind to take me with you next time, for I can't be left behind again. I don't care anything about the accommodation. I feel lonesome enough. It seems that all was happy but me. Nancy, her sister, is fixing to start Wednesday. Oh, what I would give if I could go with you." And then in another letter, she said, "I must talk a little more about going with you. I hope you won't disappoint me, for I have been packing my sea chest today, and how pleasant it would be for me to come with you. Captain Joshua Drew has taken his wife and one child with him. In fact, most all the women who have gone to sea. But if you don't let me go, you must come home. Oh, Josephus, you don't know how miserable I am when separated from you. We have letters from Nancy quite often. She wrote for me to go to sea by all means, for she likes it first rate. But I will try to do as you think, for you are a better judge than I. But everyone that has husbands to sea say they would go. And then her sister-in-law, two of her sister-in-laws go, and I love this line. She says, I asked your mother what Alan's object was in carrying Lydia to sea. She said he wanted she should know how hard he earned his money. I guess you'll have to carry me for the same purpose. I don't think Alan's wife wanted to go to sea. I think he insisted she see how he earned his money. If I just had to rely on those letters and the logbooks of her husband, I would never have known that Sally went to sea. But her son wrote a memoir of his own life at sea, and it starts with him as a young boy going on a ship with his wife, with his mom. So we know she went to sea. Now I'm going long, so I'm going to try and go very quickly through, because this, when people ask me, do you know of any women who went to sea back in 2018, this is the woman I knew. Everybody in Duxbury knows this woman. Beulah Wadsworth and went on a number of voyages with her husband before her fateful voyage in 1853. At that time, they set sail with her 9-year-old son with a load of ice for Madras, India. For those of you who don't know that we shipped ice around the globe, it's a fantastic story. So Google it. But they have a load of ice. Few weeks out, Beulah realized she's pregnant. Are they going to turn that ship around? Nope. She's on for the long haul. They go around Cape of Good Hope on their way to Asia. She's having a terrible pregnancy, but very difficult time. By the time they're discharging their ice in India, she's feeling much better. She and her son Frank check into a European hotel at the port. They go sightseeing, and everything seems like it's fine. She's not due for a while yet. They get back on the ship, and they're going to take a 4-day journey across the Bay of Bengal to Calcutta. That 4-day journey turns into a 30-day becalmed voyage. During that time, Beulah has picked up what sounds like dysentery, so she is very, very sick. That brings on her contractions. She gives birth to a healthy, although premature, baby boy, and they name him Seaborn Wadsworth. Now, Captain Wadsworth does not want to bury his wife in India, so he does the only thing he can think of doing. He has a coffin made, and he puts the alcohol, the spirits he has on board, into that coffin to preserve his wife in order to get her back to Duxbury to be buried. And this is what he writes, his sister. I had a coffin made on board, put her in it, and having some spirits on board for cargo, I got at that and filled the coffin with it, and was thus enabled to bring her here, Calcutta, 1 week after her death. Since I've been here, I've had a leaden coffin made enclosed with wood, and put the original one in, and soldered it up perfectly airtight on board ship. Thus I hope to bring the dear remains of my dear departed wife home with me, if God ever permits me to return, and deposit them in the old churchyard of her native village. The little babe she never nursed. Fortunately, we had a goat on board. The little fellow was 12 days old when we arrived here, and was bright and healthy as possible. He used to wake up every 2 or 3 hours and feed well and go to sleep again, very little trouble. Since I have arrived here, I've engaged a wet nurse for him, a native woman, and Mrs. Walker has kindly taken him under her care. So the Seth Sprague, the ship they're on, departs Calcutta with Beulah in a coffin with her alcohol, a wet nurse for little baby Seaborn. And then talk about being a footnote of a story. The wet nurse, the Indian wet nurse, suffered so badly from seasickness that Captain Wadsworth puts her off the ship on an island. And I was like, what island? Did she speak the language? Did she ever get home? But so they lose the wet nurse. Now they still had goats, but in a storm, the goats get washed overboard. And so I know we're going through a terrible formula crisis right now, and I myself fed my children formula, so I wouldn't want to be living through this time. But let me assure you that these salty dogs on this ship fed that baby hardtack and water, and he survived. He made his way all the way home, and Seaborn went to sea himself, had many children. There are descendants even on Cape Cod of Seaborn. So that actually, I had a couple other stories, but I front-loaded a little too much in the beginning. So we will stop there with sad Beulah's death. But if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them. Mm-hmm. My next story was another woman who died, but they brought her home in saltpeter, fertilizer, instead of alcohol. You use what you have. You use what you have. Go ahead, right there.
My great-grandmother was a honeymoon bride on board the Bessie. Her husband was captain. I have all their journals, my grandfather was born on land, but then went back to sea with her. But the reason they went to sea was not a million years. It was they were too poor to live on shore to afford a home. When they would come back to Cape Cod, they would live with their relatives in between voyages.
Yes, so the same thing happened to those women, the women in the latter years, and while I'm illustrating that point, I'll just, these two women here, both of them didn't have homes on shore until their husbands retired from sea. So they just lived aboard vessels, various vessels, raised their children aboard the vessels. Both of those women, when they were young and they were at sea with their fathers, said they were real salt by the time they were 6 years old. So the woman, the little tin type there, she tells the story of they left Singapore with 10 monkeys. Everybody got a monkey, including her. And I think, 10 monkeys on board a ship. Yes. Yes, they had turtles and monkeys. Yep. Anything. I mean, there's a lot of downtime on these long voyages. Go ahead.
Did you run into any examples of women at sea other than captains' wives?
I have a few examples of like stewardesses, or sometimes stewards had their wives aboard. But predominantly what I found is just captains' wives, although, I know that there's other women that go to sea. All right?
Thank you very much, Carolyn. And now I'd like to invite you into the other room. We have a lovely dessert display, so please come and get it.
I have everything.
Thank